I apologize. We apologize for not being able to get the live presentation recorded. Probably user error. But anyway, I decided I would try to put a short version or a pretty synopsis of the presentation. So folks who weren't on the Zoom and also not at the program itself have the opportunity to see this program. There's also a PDF on the website that will have the links. It'll also go through the little our intro information, and then we'll also have links to the videos that you'll see in here. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and hopefully this works. Here's the program, yay. Oops, I guess I need to start at the beginning, not there. Sorry about that. We'll start at the beginning. Okay, so I did this program. It was a two and a half hour presentation for the University Gardens as part of their backyard naturalist native plants program. And this is kind of a condensed version of that. I'm not going to go through into quite as much detail as I did during that program or during that presentation. So the first thing we're going to do is go ahead and start off with a quick review, because I would assume most of you understand or have an idea of what the overall breeding cycle is, but just in case, first they start off with doing a territorial breeding. Usually that includes singing, running around the neighborhood trying to find a place to breed and so forth. Most of the birds we can start in this area territory establishment as early as December for the great horned owls, and as late as July and August for the goldfinches. And then some birds like the dove can actually breed all year round depending upon the overall environmental conditions. So we had the territory. Then, of course, you have the choosing of the mate, and some birds have particular, routines to make those, to create those bonds and so forth. Then there's the nest building. And this past spring, I've had the opportunity to watch outside my window right above my computer. In fact, I'm now looking at that nest right now, a nesting pair of brown thrashers. They started breeding or started their nest building about the middle of March. I watched them build the nest, then sit or lay the eggs, sit on the nest for about 2 weeks. And then the hatchlings came out a little before Easter. And unfortunately, the fledglings, I saw them about 2 days before they actually fledged. And of course, they fledged the weekend of the summit, so I wasn't here, so I didn't see that. So I thought, okay, so we've got they fledged and the nest, I hadn't seen the birds around the nest. So I was thinking I would collect the nest to bring into the presentation today. However, 2 days ago, I noticed that the female is back on the nest. So they're having a second brood on the same nest. So some birds will use the nests again, some will build new nests, so forth and so on. So nesting, and some birds have three nesting time or one nesting period. Others will do several broods. Bluebirds can do 3. Mockingbirds I've known to do at least 5 in this area. So then you have the mating itself, and you have the laying of the eggs, the formation of the eggs, which is what we'll talk about a whole lot more in a minute. Then there's, whoops, sorry, back wrong way. Then we have the incubation. And this too can be anywhere from 10 days to 40 days, depending on the species. Seems like the smaller birds tend to take less time. Birds like the eagles and hawks and big hawks usually take anywhere from 25 to even as many as 40 days to incubate. And the same thing with the nestling period, can be very short or it can be very long. So depending upon, and it seems like smaller the bird, the shorter the nestling time, and also the larger the bird, obviously longer the time. Eagles, some of the hawks and stuff, it actually will take about a month before they're ready to go get out of the nest. Now, there are two kinds of nestlings. Up here on the upper right is the ducklings, shorebirds, geese, and so forth. And these are what we call precocial. And they are ready to go as soon as they get out of the egg, the nest, or out of the shell. They're a little wet. Their down bodies will dry in about 30 minutes to an hour, and they're ready to go. These guys can swim. They can, the shorebirds are out looking for food and so forth and so on. So they usually take a little bit longer in the eggshell, in the shell itself. So it takes them longer to develop in the egg. This is some advantage to the parents in that they don't have to feed the birds. They don't have to spend that time during that, what we would call the nestling stage. They fledge as soon as they are hatched. On the other hand, the attritial, which are the ones at the bottom, and which are mostly our songbirds and woodpeckers and most of the other species, they are attritial. And they are naked, and some have more feathers than others. They're a little more developed than others, but in general, they're blind. They can't survive on their own at all. So that means there's going to be a longer time where the parents have to be feeding them and taking care of them in the nest and protecting them until they can get out and get moving about. And as long as they're in the nest, they really are pretty vulnerable. So it's I don't want to say scary time, but it can be a very crucial time to keep them out, keep them protected. And then of course you have the fledgling time. And most people, when they see a fledgling on the ground, they immediately think the bird has fallen out of the nest and needs to go back to the nest, and not necessarily. They want to get the birds out of the nest as quickly as possible, because again, remember I just said in the nest, they're most vulnerable. Once they're out, even though they can't fly, they can move around, they can get away from predators, they can actually hide, and they have a better chance of surviving actually once they're out of the nest. So don't try to, put the fledglings back into a nest or something like that. The parents are there, parents are around, they'll take care of them. They'll teach them what to do. So that's just a quickie on the kids. So why is there an egg? Well, think about it. Birds want to be light. They need to be able to fly. So they don't want it, because they do multiple, quote, births, meaning that they have multiple babies at one time, or in one season, or in one nesting attempt. They can't carry all those eggs in their body because that make them too fat and too heavy. So weight is probably one of the biggest reasons they use eggs. It's also a little easier to thermal regulate the birds, the eggs. There is an energy expenditure, meaning that the female, it does take a lot of energy out of her to lay the eggs. But at the same time, it's not as long a period as like for most mammals or for humans and so forth. So it's kind of a balancing act there. And then finally, they've actually inherited this trait. Eggs were the first means of, well, I shouldn't say that first means of reproduction, but predates the live births from that. So, and they, of course, our ancestors are obviously the dinosaurs. Here's a lot of them come from what they call the theropods. Although in my research, I discovered that there were, I'm going to say, they found some DNA from a Tyrannosaurus Rex. They were able to extract from a bone. And then they did comparisons to a whole bunch of different animals, reptiles, mammals, birds, and the two birds that, or the two species that came closest to the T-Rex was actually the the chicken and the crocodile. Go figure. So anyway, anyway, so this is probably the crux of this presentation, which is really fascinating. I'm going to use videos primarily because I can't do any better at explaining. And of course, pictures a lot, how do you want to say, pictures worth 1,000 words. So let me click on this and hopefully it'll. All right, we're gonna look at another video in a second, but before, a couple of things I wanted to point out. He mentioned in there that the albatross had stored the sperm, and many birds can do this. So the egg doesn't get fertilized right away. There are pockets within this system and areas within the system that they can store. In fact, ducks, and if they don't, the female doesn't approve of the particular male, she can actually just shunt it off into a sack and never use those sperms. So it's kind of interesting the way they take a while. So, and the other thing is that there are usually several of the ovaries developing at a time, but they only release one at a time, one a day. That's why the chicken, continues to lay every day because of hormones that come up. And that's the same even with our birds. The wild birds, certain hormones trigger the development of the ovaries, and in the passerines or in the wild birds, they're genetically, how do you want to say, predisposed to a certain number of eggs. They won't continue to lay forever, although some ducks and geese will do that. If you take the eggs away, they will continue to produce more eggs. But the problem is at a certain point, the hormones then begin to abate, and those they'll stop laying eggs. And that's actually true of a chicken too, but they usually take a much longer time to do that. Whoops, excuse me again, I went too far. So let's look at that. That's how this is basically what he was showing us, that you have the membrane put on. There's several membranes we'll talk about in a second. Sorry about this. My computer is doing it, has its own thing. Okay. So let's look at the second video, which is even more fascinating.
Look inside this incubator. These eggs were laid 21 days ago, and this one is just about to hatch. If you listen, you can hear the chick pecking at the inside of its shell. Soon it will break through and take its first breath of fresh air. It's a dramatic moment, that first breath, one shared by so many creatures, including us. But hold on, think about this. When you were in the womb, you got oxygen from your mother through your umbilical cord. But for the last 21 days, this chick has been cut off from its mother, sealed inside an egg. So how does it get oxygen? An egg seems like a perfectly self-contained system. The yolk and the white contain all the nutrients you need to build a baby chick. As with a human baby, all this construction requires oxygen. And that's the one thing that isn't stored inside the egg. So where does it come from? Well, take a look at this. When you magnify an egg shell 1,000 times, you can see the calcium carbonate crystals that make up the shell, and here and there, tiny holes, 1,000th of an inch across. And these tiny holes let outside air filter in. So oxygen can pass through the shell, but the chick growing inside doesn't have working lungs yet. How does it get that oxygen into its bloodstream? Well, a few days after an egg is laid, something amazing happens. When you hold a fertilized egg up in front of a bright light, you can see it, a delicate network of blood vessels that grows out of the embryo's abdomen and presses up against a membrane just inside the shell. Oxygen from the air comes in through the tiny holes in the shell and then diffuses into the embryo's blood. and the growing chick gets rid of carbon dioxide at the same time. It all looks remarkably similar to your early days in the womb. There was a yolk sac, at least at first, and a network of blood vessels growing out from the place where your belly button now is. But instead of pressing up against the edge of a shell, your blood vessels reached the wall of the womb, where they joined with an outer membrane to form the placenta. In the placenta, oxygen from your mother diffused into your bloodstream. It really is an exact mirror of what's going on in the eggs of birds and reptiles. While all this is happening, lungs are developing. We humans don't fill those lungs with air until after we're born, but chicks get a head start. That's because the whole time oxygen is coming in through the shell, moisture is slowly evaporating out. That creates an empty space that gradually fills with air. A day or so before the chick is ready to hatch, it starts to move. It punctures that air pocket and fills its lungs. It then has just enough oxygen to battle out of the egg and take its first breath of fresh air. This is Skunk Bear, NPR's science show. Please subscribe to our channel and check out our other videos.
I had never really thought about where or how the embryo actually got oxygen. And I know, everybody needs oxygen to grow and so forth. So this is fascinating. Like I said, these two videos probably summarize much better than I could ever do verbally and in explaining the different things. Sorry. Like I said, my computer has a mind of its own. There are two more videos on here, and you can, I won't go into those right now, that are kind of fascinating. The embryonic development one is kind of more of a artsy look at the development. And the last one is just another thing about the egg and how it's created. So, or what the egg itself is like. And let's look at that a little more closely, the egg itself. So this egg has lots of parts to it, which, again, we think of shell, yolk, and albumin. But there's lots of, especially in a fertilized egg, there's a lot of things going on. So again, the embryo is down here. The yolk sac, remember the yolk, that little disc was on the edge of the yolk. And that's what got fertilized, and that becomes the embryo. So as the embryo grows, the yolk sac gets smaller. That's also where a lot of the nutrition is coming from, that because that is the proteins and the fat that they need to grow. Let's go back out to the shell. Obviously is out there, and we'll talk a little more about that. But within the shell, although it's not on here, there are a couple of things that are important. One is there's what on the outside of the shell, there's what's called a bloom. And this has to do with, it's actually a dust and bacteria kind of safeguard or whatever. It's a I don't want to say membrane, but it's a coating that helps prevent dust getting in, because remember, the egg is porous. So they want to keep out kind of dust particles or a bacteria that's can damage the yolk or the fetus, not the fetus, the embryo. So the bloom is, has to do with the fact that in many other countries, or if you have truly fresh eggs that you bring into your house, you can leave them actually on the table or on your counter and not refrigerate them, as long as you haven't washed them. If you wash them, that bloom goes away. Well, most eggs that we get from from the grocery store and stuff are all washed. So that's why you need to put them in the refrigerator right away, because that helps does some of the prevention of bacteria growth and so forth and so on. But if you get, if you have chickens yourself, or ducks, you can bring those eggs in and leave them on the counter. And that kind of makes sense because, the egg is out in the nest. It's not refrigerated by any means. So it needs that kind of covering. And then right inside of the the egg, the shell, the calcium shell. There are two more little membranes that also are antibacterial. And if you were to do that experiment with the eggshell and putting it in vinegar, you would see these other little very, very thin layers or membranes. And in fact, sometimes when you actually, hard boil an egg and you crack it open, you can see a membrane that's kind of adhering to the shell itself. And that's these outer and inner membranes that are for bacterial protection. Then you have, of course, the albumin, which is the egg white that we know. And if you have problems with cholesterol, you can eat those proteins because there's no fat in there, but the yolk you can't, because that's where all the fat and the cholesterol is. Then there's another membrane that protects the actual, so you have the albumin out here, then you have another membrane that protects it's not just the embryo, but the overall embryo sac or whatever anyway, it kind of is another a sac in there. Then obviously the embryo, this is where the respiration takes place. And then another sac. So there's lots of sacs in here. And then the air pocket over here. And as he said, if you've ever wondered why you get that indentation when you do the hard boil an egg, and if you have a really fresh egg, you have very little indentation. And that's because, again, the egg is porous, and as the embryo develops, moisture, as it says, goes out. And that's true even if it's not fertilized. So the longer it sits in your refrigerator, the more air gets in there. So you have a bigger pocket. So if the eggs are a couple, week or so old, then you'll have a bigger air pocket in there because the moisture has come out of the egg itself. So kind of, it really is a pretty perfect life support system outside of the body in and of itself. Of course, it has to be regulated with the type of warmth and so forth and so on. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So here are a couple of extraordinary facts about eggs. This biggest one is not an ostrich egg. This is actually the elephant bird egg, which is extinct. This goes back again to our dinosaur relatives. This is the ostrich egg, and this is a hummingbird or a bee hummingbird egg. And just kind of give you a little bit of an idea. A bee hummingbird, there'll be 4,700 bee hummingbird eggs would make up an ostrich egg. An ostrich egg will be about the same weight as your laptop. A bee hummingbird egg is probably about the weight of a paperclip, a regular paperclip. Now, the interesting thing, as we said, that there's one egg, a day, often with chickens and even with birds, your other type of birds, they could only lay one egg a day. You have to go through that system. However, the kiwi, which is not a big bird, it's probably about the size of a quail or a bobwhite. There's a quail. They're kind of small, or a smaller chicken, not even as big as your typical domestic chicken. And their egg will take up at least 30% of their body. Gotta stop using that. And you can see down here that it's pretty impressive. This egg takes up, so they only lay one egg a season. It would, I can't imagine having 30% of a human body taken up by a baby. That's a lot of percentage, to say the least. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about color. Now, why do you think eggs have color? Well, obviously one is camouflage, both in the nest, and in this case, this is a killdeer egg, and it's just out in the gravel or on the beach. A lot of shorebirds just nest in scrapes, and their eggs look a whole lot like the surrounding around them. Another one is, again, protection from bacteria. Some of the pigments actually that pigment stuff has the what do I want to say, has the bacterial protection in it. When I actually did the demonstration in the vinegar and had some eggs at the meeting, and when it was dissolving the calcium, which is the base layer, the pigment membrane, I guess you would call it, actually didn't dissolve. So it kind of floated at the top, and I took that off, and you can actually see the pigment part as well, and then how the whole egg and sac are together. But that pigment will help protect against bacteria as well. It also helps maintain the egg temperature or thermodynamics of the egg. It seems like research has kind of discovered that eggs, even of the same species, that are laid by birds further north tend to be darker. And of course, that's because the darker pigment will actually absorb and keep the egg warmer. And so when the parent is away getting food and so forth, it will maintain some of that temperature. So that's another thing. It also has some protection, UV protection in those layers, which they've discovered. It also might, they're not sure, it's some of these other ones in here, the idea that it might signal the quality. In some of the readings that I was looking at, it would say eggs laid at the end of a cycle tend to be not as colorful as the ones at the beginning. So there might be some changes in quality of the overall embryo in there, and the viability of the embryo. And then some birds can actually, their patterns, they recognize their own patterns. This becomes really pretty helpful when it comes to the parasites, like the cowbird and the cuckoos and stuff like that, who parasitize the eggs, the nests of other birds. And excuse me. If you read, or if you haven't read, you need to, Jeanette Ackerman's, excuse me, The Genus of Birds and Way of Birds. She talks at length about the battle between the parasitic birds and or the birds that parasitize other nests, and the nest host, and how they will actually change the patterns on their eggs to kind of defeat the interloper egg in there, and recognize that bluebirds will recognize the cowbird and actually just build right over it, over the nest. So there's a lot of things so there's recognition in the eggs. Not all birds do it, but a lot of birds do. And as I said, there's a lot of variation based on geographic range, whether it's, further south, north, higher elevations, so forth and so on, that could change the colors. And even within a species, in Texas, you might have a bluebird that is a really dark blue, and in New York, a light blue, or vice versa. It would probably be more likely, since it's the further north, it's darker. But anyway, it will vary within species and across the overall scope of all the birds. Okay, all right. Another thing with color is that is the actual pigment part. The base layer is obvious calcium, and that's white. They might add blue or something like that to it, but they only have two pigments, which is kind of interesting, and they're not the two pigments I would have thought they had. One is a blue, and one is a reddish brown. And considering, how many other colors are out there and how many other pigments you have in other species and and plants and stuff, I would have thought there would be more pigments. But they can make, I don't know how they do it, but the combination of these two pigments can give you everything from lavender to a pinkish color to of course, obviously brown, red, etc. So depending upon the genetic makeup of the birds, and actually, I think I was reading some of the research seems to indicate that they also might that genetic makeup of the coloring of the use of the pigments might change, can evolve, and that goes back to things like if they're being parasitized and so forth and so on. So even the mix of these pigments can change. The other interesting thing is they've discovered that if they actually show bolder colors under the UV light, and we don't usually see a yellow egg or this lime green egg. We don't see it, but these are eggs that are under UV light, and these other colors kind of pop out, which is kind of interesting. It's kind of like, no, never mind. We won't say that. I could get myself in trouble with that one. So let's talk a little bit about how you would identify these eggs. And the first and foremost and easiest thing, this will be true of identifying nest eggs as well. Not nests as well as the eggs is what I wanted to say. If you see the parent, if I see the parent sitting on a nest and there are eggs in there, we know what kind of bird is there. So my brown thrashers, I've watched them. I know those babies are going to be brown thrashers, et cetera, et cetera. Now that does get, again, if the cowbird comes along, then you might have a cowbird in there and you won't know that until you might see a songbird, or somebody was saying the other day, there's a little chickadee. They have a chickadee that's feeding a cowbird right now, which is which is kind of unusual since cowbirds don't generally go into cavities. But anyway, so parents, if you know the parents, the same thing as you see a bird going into a nest, then obviously that's what those eggs are going to be. Size does help. This kind of gives you a little look at the possible sizes of eggs compared to a dime. And if you were at the program, if you were at the senior center, you would have seen the display of eggs that I had there, and probably be surprised, like myself, at some of the size of some of these eggs that produce these bigger birds, like the crow egg and the pileated egg were much smaller than I would have expected, but they produce a much bigger bird. So it's kind of interesting. But obviously, the smaller the egg, the smaller the bird, and the larger the egg, the larger the bird, obviously. So you can kind of get an idea. Now, shape is another one. A round egg often is a cavity-dwelling egg, because it doesn't matter whether it rolls or not. All these other shapes probably have to do with, making sure the egg doesn't roll off the edge of the nest or cliff or wherever it is. Also, I would think eggs that are in a pendulum kind of nest, they would also be a little rounder. But the egg shape is kind of created, is an indication of where or what kind of nest the bird would be in. And again, you can kind of get an idea, particularly these kind of very pointed eggs tend to make sure that the egg doesn't roll as what they want to avoid. Okay, so color, all right. Now we have here what looks like, if you're not looking, if you haven't read the caption, might be bluebird eggs with a cowbird egg, right? Well, that's not. These are actually chipping sparrow eggs. So color, we've been headed in our brain since we were kids. Robins, if it's a blue egg, it's a robin's egg. And yeah, it might be a robin's egg, but the problem is there are many species that actually have blue eggs. Whether they're spotted, what kind of spots they have, and all that will actually then make a difference. So just to take a quick look at the blue eggs, obviously a bluebird does a blue egg, and you can see actually here some of those other membranes that we were talking about earlier. So a bluebird has a blue egg. The American robin has a blue egg. So if it's a small one, it's probably a smaller one, it's probably a bluebird, or it could be a larger one, is going to be American robin. Stop that. Catbirds are blue eggs. And I think we'll talk a little bit of, no, we won't do that there. House finches. Now, my guess is a lot of, I probably the most commonly found egg is a blue egg. And I've always, like everyone else, thought, oh, these are bluebird eggs. But I bet a lot of the ones that we actually see are actually house finch eggs, because since house finches tend to be much more likely to be around your house, also there are more of them, that a lot of these blue eggs that we find on the ground and so forth. Now, mind you, all because you find a broken egg on the ground doesn't mean that the egg was broken. It could be because a lot of the birds will take the eggshells out of the nest and then go drop them someplace else. So it could be that they've hatched and then they just are cleaning out the nest to keep things clean. So don't assume that was an egg that didn't make it. Okay, so a great blue heron has a blue egg. That was kind of a surprise to me. A wood thrush has a blue egg. Now they are different shades of blue. The problem is that if it's been exposed to the air after the hatching, it tends to lose its color or even change color a little bit. So what color blue it is ahead of time, you're not always quite sure. And then a red-winged blackbird is also a blue egg. But again, we noticed on the house finch and the blackbird, we have a different set of patterns in here. So the pattern is going to be almost as important as the color of the egg. And that's the markings here. They will make it, you have the same shape, the same color in the back. They do get their, I don't want to say they're definitely, these are pretty obviously different patterns, but if you were to look at some of the eggs that again on that the display that I had, some of the patterns from different species look very close and very similar. So again, difficult to necessarily tell, unless you're a real expert on eggs, tell just from the markings, but it will give you kind of an idea of what birds are in there, what bird it belongs to. The other thing has to do with, is it shiny or is it kind of matte? There's actually texture on those eggs as well. And you can see this is a microscopic view of I forget which egg it is. Maybe I think it's the blue one up at the top, that it actually has kind of little ridges and stuff, whereas the bottom one is pretty glossy and so forth. You can kind of see the ridges in there, and this is glossy. And again, if you had looking at the eggs that we have, you can see the difference that some are a lot glossier, and you can actually see that with even chicken eggs. Some chicken eggs seem to be glossier, and others seem to be more of a matte. So that makes a difference as well. If you find a nest with eggs, and if you're not sure what the nest is, more eggs usually indicate a duck or a goose or something like that. The smaller birds only usually have 1 or 2 eggs. Most passerines or songbirds will come within anywhere from 2 to 5 eggs. So quantity of eggs in there might make a difference as well, help you in identifying it. Also habitat. So that, you're not going to find an osprey nest or an osprey egg in the middle of the desert. as simple as that. So you keep it, kind of an idea of what it is. And then the last piece, which is similar to the habitat, is the actual nest design. If you find a nest with eggs in it, the design of the nest is going to give you a clue back to the parents. So that's the best thing to go back to that. So here's your real quick overview of nests. So the reason for nests are to protect the eggs, to shelter the eggs, to cushion the eggs, and to camouflage the eggs. It's simple, pretty simple at that. You can see the camouflage in the upper right. Those are really hard. They can be, this was actually almost at eye level at one of the greenways, and it was hard to see, except that if you'd see the birds going in and out of the nest. So that's the purpose of the eggs. Now here are the kinds of eggs, or not kinds of nests. There is a variety, but they come down to like 5 or 6 basic structures of nests. One structure can be in more than one place, and there is some, I don't want to say bleeding, but some overlap between some of them, and we'll talk real quickly about some. So the only real scrape nester we have around here is the killdeer, and he just lays its eggs in little rocks, parking lots, gravel pits. And there was one at Chantilly last year, right in the middle of the grass, and just kind of set themselves down and sit, and there they are. They don't build anything. It's just a scrape. And the scrapes can be on the edge of a cliff. It can be in turkey vultures will do it, in an old abandoned building. So there's no nest there. The next one is kind of a burrow, and the one we have around here is the kingfisher, which most people don't realize actually burrow into sides of the creeks and so forth. Now, as I mentioned at the meeting, I'm a little concerned about a lot of the stream restoration pieces that have been going on in the county, because I understand why they want to kind of widen the streams and kind of level them out, because those big, the steep edges of the streams cause more problems and flooding. But the problem is, if they get rid of those kind of embankments, steeper embankments, then there are fewer places for the kingfisher to actually nest. And they've kind of they've restored the creek that goes through the university. And I understand that in the future it will regenerate and it'll still be a good environment, but it might not be as good an environment for the kingfisher, and the kingfishers are gone from the campus. So I have no idea where they're nesting now, but they need to burrow into something. They don't go into cavity, boxes or anything like that. So this is a concern of mine, and it'll be interesting to see how numbers compare with kingfishers over the next couple of years with these restorations. Next one is a platform. Now this platform and the next one, which is a cup, kind of overlap. Even a platform will have a cup in it, but basically think of a platform as being on something flat and usually more exposed than the cups. And then the cups, cavity came next. Obviously woodpeckers, most of us are very familiar with the cups, or the cavity dwellers, because we put up bird boxes and so forth. And they're probably one of the more common feeder birds that come in. But there are a lot of cavity birds as well as the cup. Now, I would say the majority of the passerines or the songbirds are going to have some variation of the cup. There are actually, folks who study the nests and so forth. There are structural elements to a nest. Usually, there's 4 main ones. Not all cup not all nests have all four of these, but it's interesting, even all songbirds will have a cup somewhere. In this case, it's kind of woven around the to a V in a bush. It could be a cup on in the platform kind of thing. So there's going to be a cup to the center where the eggs are, and that's usually lined with different kind of mosses and nice soft things. The pendant is the same type of thing, but these usually are hanging, woven, but obviously there's a cup inside of that. Then the sphere, or the oven kind of thing. Now it's interesting because a mockingbird, not a mockingbird, a Carolina wren, even if it's in a big grill, it did that to me one year. It put its nest in my grill. It filled everything with other leaves and all kinds of stuff, but in the corner there was kind of what I would saw more of a sphere nest, in that they had a cover over it and stuff like that. It was kind of almost a cavity kind of thing that they went into within the cavity. So that's kind of interesting. They did the same thing in my in a mailbox. There was a cavity. The mailbox is a cavity, and within that there was another cavity. But the sphere, our ovenbird, the meadowlark, towhees will also sometimes give you a kind of a sphere. Or now this last one we don't have around here, but it's just a fascinating type of behavior, or incubation behavior. This is much like your turtles or other reptiles that bury their eggs into sand or into some kind of mound, and these mounds can get up 3 or 4 or 5 feet tall. This bird is actually from Australia, is in Australia, and they build these piles of whatever, and then the eggs are laid inside, and they will adjust the temperature of the pile by taking stuff, debris away, or adding it to keep the temperature pretty much the same. The interesting thing is when these kids or these birds hatch, they come out and their parents are nowhere around. They are totally on their own, just like the turtles. They're just, off on their own. They have to find their way to the ocean, or they have to find their way to food. So they're obviously precocial and ready to go. But it's kind of an interesting way. And you can see here the definite connection with the reptiles and dinosaurs. All right, so that was your nest. Very simple, quick nest overview. Okay, how not to identify an egg. Don't pick up a wild bird egg. Don't touch it. This guy is actually a researcher, and he was doing something, but I used the picture to say you're not supposed to do that. You want to avoid stressing any of the adults, but minimize the time around the nest and so forth, and keep a safe distance. I mean, that's key. A lot of birds, if you flush them off the nest, they won't come back. Not all birds are that, but bluebirds, some of our birds that are used to being around people, or around buildings, around humans, are probably will sit tighter on nests and come back. But if you're out in the wild and you come across a nest, really stay away from it, because it will. You don't want to flush that bird off and leave those eggs exposed anywhere. Okay, so these are your basic references for finding out about eggs. The other one I don't have on here for the nests is Nest Watch, which is also a Cornell. But these are your basic for eggs, places to find out about the eggs. The Peterson book is, it can be a little bit more jargony than All About Birds, and Birds of the World, which is also a Cornell product. is kind of in between being really scientific. Well, it is much more scientific than All About Birds, but it will use a little more jargon. Peterson tends to use a little bit more jargon. If you start reading any of the descriptions of the eggs, you will see very quickly that when they start talking about color, they may actually have 4 or 5, 6 different colors. You'll say anything from blue to buff to this to that to that, with different shades of color. So you can see why this is not an easy endeavor if you're going to start looking at eggs and trying to figure out what eggs are. If you have any questions or anything, you can email me through the Mecklenburg Audubon website, which is just mechaudubon@gmail.com. Otherwise, hopefully this was helpful, and thank you for listening.